On the 28th of May 1987, Mathias Rust managed to make international headlines by flying his Cessna 172P from Helsinki, Finland to a spectacular landing in Moscow's Red Square. His flight was both an amazing achievement and an immense humiliation to the Soviet war machine. He was tracked several times by Soviet air defense forces and civilian air traffic controllers, as well as Soviet Air Force interceptor aircraft. The Soviet fighters did not receive permission to shoot him down, and his aeroplane was mistaken for a friendly aircraft several times. Also, on the 28th of May, was Border Guards Day, leaving many guards distracted. After landing, Rust was arrested and subsequently sentenced to 4 years in a general regime labour camp for violation of border crossing and air traffic regulations, and for provoking an emergency situation upon his landing. After 14 months in prison, he was pardoned by Andrei Gromyko, the chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet, and released. Who was Mathias Rust? Born on the 1st of June 1968, Mathias Rust was a normal boy from Hamburg, West Germany, growing up during the middle of the Cold War. One day, during the autumn of 1986, whilst he was watching TV at his parents' home, an idea came to him. After a summit between the US and Soviet presidents in Reykjavik had ended in a stalemate, the teenager, who had a passion for politics, felt he wanted to do something to make a difference. I thought every human on this planet is responsible for some progress, and I was looking for an opportunity to take my share in it. Rust already had a pilot's license and had clocked up 50 hours in the air when it occurred to him to put his skill to use. I was thinking I could use the aircraft to build an imaginary bridge between the West and East to show that a lot of people in Europe wanted to improve relations between our two worlds. On the 13th of May 1987, he told his parents he was going to tour Northern Europe in a Cessna airplane in order to clock up hours towards his professional pilot's license. Rust left Östersund Airport near Hamburg and his hometown Wedel in his rented Cessna F-172P, registration DECJB, which was modified by removing some of the seats and replacing them with auxiliary fuel tanks. His first stop was in the Shetland Islands, then going on to the Faroe Islands, spending one night in each. Next came the capital of Iceland, Reykjavik, then Bergen in Norway, before he arrived on the 25th of May in the Finnish capital, Helsinki. He spent several days trying to decide if he really had the courage to go through with the plan. He had good reason to be nervous. The USSR had the largest air defense system in the world. Less than 5 years earlier, a South Korean civilian airliner had been shot down after straying into Soviet airspace, causing the death of all 269 passengers on board. Of course I was afraid to lose my life. I was weighing if it was really reasonable to take this kind of risk. At the end I came to the conclusion, I have to risk it. The flight. On the morning of the 28th of May, he told air traffic control in Helsinki he would be heading to Stockholm, in Sweden. Even then, he wasn't completely sure he would go through with it. I made the final decision about half an hour after departure. I just changed the direction to 170 degrees and I was heading straight down to Moscow. Back in Helsinki, operators at air control began to worry. Rust was heading in the wrong direction and then vanished from their radar screens before he could make radio contact. An enormous manhunt was launched by the Finnish Coast Guard, and when a patch of oil was spotted on the sea surface, divers were brought in to search for a wreck. While they were hunting for him, Rust was sitting snug in his cockpit as his plane crossed into Soviet airspace over Estonia. Within minutes, he had been picked up by Soviet radar, and less than an hour later, a MiG fighter jet approached him. It passed me on my left side, so close that I could see the two pilots sitting in the cockpit, and I saw of course the red star of the wing of the aircraft. Rust was terrified, but instead of attacking him, the jet passed by and disappeared into the clouds. A combination of unbelievable luck and human error had led to Rust's plane being mistaken for a friendly aircraft. A plane crash the previous day and an ongoing rescue operation, along with training for new pilots, had led to confusion in the air and in control centres. Somehow Rust managed to make it hundreds of miles across Soviet airspace to the capital without any further contact from USSR defence forces. I couldn't believe I actually survived. I had calculated at the time that my chances of survival were about 50-50, and after I reached my destination, I knew that I really was on the lucky side. But his relief at seeing the spires and domes of Moscow quickly faded when he realised that landing was going to be difficult. He wanted to bring the plane down in the middle of the Red Square, in order to make a big statement, but the landmark was packed full of people. On the ground, Soviet citizens were stopping and looking up in amazement as a small white plane circled just 30 feet above the ground. Finally, Rust spotted a 4-lane bridge next to St. Basil's Cathedral, so he circled around one more time and touched down there. Later, when he was questioned by the Russian police, he learned that the bridge was usually spanned by thick cables, which would have made a landing impossible. By chance, they had been removed from the bridge that very morning for maintenance. The police presumed that I had co-operators in Moscow who had arranged it so that I would be able to land. At around 1900, just as the sun was going down, Rust taxied his plane into the square and climbed out of the cockpit to greet the crowds which gathered around him. They wanted to know where the young foreigner was from and why he was there. "I am here on a peace mission from Germany," he told them. When they shook his hand, glad to meet an ally, he had to explain that he came from the other Germany, West, not the Communist East, as they had presumed. Aftermath. Everyone around him was very impressed. Even the security services kept saying what a brave boy they thought he was. Once the police had recovered from the shock of finding an unauthorized aircraft parked at the gates of the Kremlin, Rust was arrested. He spent hours trying to persuade the authorities that he had acted alone and was not part of some sinister plot hatched by foreign governments. In the Kremlin, there was shock and plenty of red faces as the full extent of the humiliating incident became apparent. But it is likely that President Gorbachev realized he could use the opportunity to his advantage to rid himself of military officials whom he saw as standing in the way of his reforms. Within a couple of days, the Minister of Defence had been forced to retire, and the head of the Air Defence Services had been sacked. Over the next few months, more than 150 people lost their jobs. Rust was charged and pleaded guilty to violating international flight rules and illegally crossing the Soviet border. After some confusion in court, he pleaded not guilty to malicious hooliganism. The judge sentenced him to 4 years in a labour camp for what he called an act of adventurism. Despite being allowed to serve his time in Lefortovo prison in Moscow, Rust took his imprisonment badly, struggling with eating and the confinement. Then, in 1988, following the signing of a non-proliferation treaty by Reagan and Gorbachev, Rust was released as a gesture of goodwill after serving only 14 months. Rust's return to Germany on the 3rd of August 1988 was accompanied by huge media attention, but he did not talk to the journalists assembled. His family had sold the exclusive rights to the story to the German magazine Stern for 100,000 Deutschmarks. He reported that he had been treated well in the Soviet prison. Journalists described him as psychologically unstable and unworldly in a dangerous manner. Rust's rented Cessna F-172P was sold to Japan, where it was exhibited for several years. In 2008, it was returned to Germany and was placed in the German Museum of Technology in Berlin. Rust's flight was seen as so incredible to Muscovites that it wormed its way into popular culture. For a while, Red Square was jokingly referred to as Sheremetyevo 3, as Sheremetyevo 1 and 2 are the two terminals at Moscow Airport. Today, he makes his living as a financial analyst and a yoga instructor. He says he has no regrets about what he did, and believes he had a hand in helping President Gorbachev with his reforms. I am very convinced that I enabled him to push through his perestroika and glasnost much faster than he would have done without me. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, then please give it a like. And for more amazing tales and thrilling stories, don't forget to subscribe to Uncovered Secrets. Also, Hit the bell icon to stay notified for every release.